Hello, and welcome to the Social Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Jo Sharp. On this show, we have explored the ways that social protection can contribute to climate adaptation, mitigation, and just transition. But for it to play those roles, social protection needs to be better integrated into national climate policies and planning. In 2025, countries are updating their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which set out their climate commitments under the Paris Agreement and outline efforts to reduce national emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. Integrating social protection into climate instruments like these will be critical to achieving transition to post-carbon economies and unlocking climate financing for the expansion of social protection systems. In today's episode, we're hearing about countries that are working on this integration, with a special focus on how Cambodia has brought social protection to the climate policy table. My first guest today is Dr. Matthew Walsham, Social Protection Specialist, Climate, in the Social Protection team at FAO. Welcome, Matt.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Matt, let's kick off with a bit of an overview. Why is it important for countries to be considering social protection as part of their national climate policies, including in these latest round of NDCs?
So I think essentially social protection has this hugely important role in supporting countries to make their climate action more inclusive. That would be around climate adaptation, climate mitigation, just transitions, and also increasingly response to loss and damage. So by more inclusive, I mean that it's reaching the most vulnerable communities. We're also generally least responsible for the impacts of climate change. We know that climate action at the moment isn't really reaching the most vulnerable countries at scale, but also the communities within those countries and specific population groups. And then secondly, I think social protection has this existing systems in place and this ability to operate at scale. And I think that this role is now really well recognized at the global level. It was talked about a lot in the IPCC's sixth assessment report, but also you see it in the UNFCCC decisions, work streams like global adaptation, just transition work plan, again, around loss and damage. And that global recognition is super important. So it's great that we're at that stage. In this latest round of NDCs, it's rare we really see the opportunity to embed this into national climate strategies, national climate action, their own plans going forward. So that's evolved a little bit as well as NDCs have evolved. The NDCs initially much more focused around climate mitigation specifically, so reducing CO2 emissions essentially. But now we can see that NDCs are increasingly speaking to the adaptation agenda, again, solar and damage. So they've become this really critical strategy setting out the overall direction for countries. And I think maybe just the thing to say about the process as well. So the documents is super important, but it's also the process. So the fact that it's usually led by ministries of environment, essentially with ministries of finance involved and ministries of social development, or the agencies, ministries with responsibility for social protection haven't always been around the table in discussing the development of the climate strategy. So getting involved in the NDC revision process is also a really important step for them being involved in climate strategy and implementation going forward.
This is a conversation that feels emerging, relatively recent. How has this discussion been received by climate policymakers? As you were saying, it's often the ministries of climate or the ministries of environment that are running the NDC process, and of course the international players who are working in the climate policy space.
Yes, so I think you're right to characterize it as relatively recent, and also perhaps people from outside of the social protection kind of world or the sector or the ministries might have an understanding of one element of social protection. For example, it might be more focused around the role of social protection in relation to shocks, which is obviously super important, but then this kind of broader role in terms of supporting inclusive adaptation or in addressing maybe some of the negative social impacts of climate mitigation policies. Some of these policies that might restrict, say, land use, whether it's access to forestry or fishery resources, for example, can then impact really negatively on the livelihoods of the poorest, or changes to subsidy regimes, these kinds of things. But then I think actually more broadly, a lot of people won't even really have come across social protection in the way that we talk about it and understand it. So it's been a bit of a journey. We still have to engage within our own institutions. So to work with our climate colleagues, I don't have to say within FAO, but within all the other institutions that we partner with on this agenda, and then within countries themselves as well, to get those conversations going. We recognize the need to work collaboratively to bridge this gap, I guess, between social protection and climate. And we've got various fora within which we're working. So one of these is the Universal Social Protection 2030 grouping. We've got a working group on social protection and climate change that I co-chair along with colleagues from ILO and the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre, but it's a wide network. And we've been working collectively to try to bring our messaging together. For example, developing briefing notes for ministries of social development, explaining why they should engage with the climate agenda. A similar briefing note from Ministry of Environment and Finance that says, why should social protection be on your agenda? And that second note was developed, in partnership with the NDC partnership. And that's been a great collaboration, really, because we talked with them about the need for the climate community to get a better understanding of social protection. And we've been able to work with them to tailor those messages so that they make sense, so that they resonate with climate colleagues.
So how are we seeing countries start to think about including social protection in their NDCs?
Sure. We did a review through FAO. It was a wider review of agri-food systems in the NDCs and the different elements that were embedded in the last round of NDCs. But it included a systematic look at the inclusion of social protection. And we found 13% of the current round of NDCs have social protection measures embedded. But then that's slightly higher in low-income countries, 22%, and in sub-Saharan Africa, 21%. So slightly higher in those settings, but it's still 80% of those countries don't include social protection, if you want to put it that way. There are some standout examples. So a good example would be Mozambique, which has a really specific set of objectives embedded in its NDC, also in its national adaptation plan. So mentioning even particular programs, the Productive Social Action Program, which is the public works program in Mozambique, and a sort of set of different things that it's seeking to achieve in relation to climate through PASP and these other programs. And then that's a really interesting example because they also have a GCF, a Green Climate Fund project there specifically to work on that agenda, $28 million approved last year. So aligned, very strongly aligned with the actions set out in its NDC. So it's difficult to say right now about what that's going to look like because basically most countries still have not submitted their NDCs. But you're seeing some examples coming through. So I think Somalia is really interesting. Somalia's NDC just released, which has a strong set of measures around social protection, particularly in relation to gender, but then also mentions around child protection, its role in relation to just transitions as well. So the use of social protection for workers, vulnerable groups affected by climate change during the economic shift towards low carbon economies. You see references in Brazil's NDC. They talk about social protection, its role in just transitions. They mention also familiar, including there in relation to some financing mechanisms, so specifically around sustainable sovereign bonds. So Zambia's got some references to the role of social protection in relation to adaptation linked to the they haven't been fixed yet, but the current global goal on adaptation draft indicators. So you're seeing the ones that are coming through, you're seeing some hopeful signs, I think, but we'll have to wait a little bit until we've seen the full set come through to understand whether this agenda's moved forward from where we were during the revision 5 years ago of the last set of NDCs.
You've also started to talk about climate financing there. Climate financing is being proposed in some quarters as a source of financing for social protection in the context of the broader push to extend coverage, achieve universal social protection, and so on. You just gave a good example of how the NDC and climate financing have come together for Mozambique. Are you hoping that including social protection in NDCs might facilitate greater access to climate finance for the purpose of developing and building national social protection systems?
Yes, so I think absolutely. Hopefully, embedding social protection into NDCs is a strong sign of government commitment and intent to use social protection as an instrument for climate action going forward. And that will help countries to reach out to different sources of finance, different forms of finance, to then draw that down and use it to enhance their social protection system to deliver this climate action. So, the Mozambique example, I think, is something we would very much like to see other countries follow. I think, again, talking about the document, but also the process, the fact that it found its way in there suggests that those discussions, were going on between the different ministries at the time. So you've got already an engagement between ministries of social development and environment and also finance. So that's, I think, really important. With the multilateral climate funds, I think it's a really important signal to them. If it's in the NDCs, then you can clearly show if you're developing a project that this is aligned with government strategies. So, just a little flag, there'll be a co-published report between FAO and the GCF looking at that, or presenting the findings of that review of their portfolio. That should be out in early September. Then you look at other funds. The Global Environment Facility is gearing up for its 9th replenishment, and in the climate funds under GEF, there seems to be a much stronger role for social protection envisaged in the next lap. But then also, it's not just about getting it in the document. What we want to see is, once that's in place, the implementation agenda. How do we support countries to actually do this in practice on the ground? How do we support countries to bring in additional sources of finance that can complement domestic financing that's being dedicated to this? None of these programs will be financed just by international climate finance. It's coming in and leveraging existing flows of domestic resources that will always be at a bigger scale, because hopefully the groundwork is there, and hopefully we see a shift in this round of NDCs that enables us then to work together with countries to push this agenda forward.
Dr. Matthew Walsham, thank you very much for joining me on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great to have the chance to talk about this.
Up next, I'm speaking with Shreng Soporn Rikshamai, who is Deputy Secretary General at the General Secretariat for the National Social Protection Council for the Government of the Kingdom of Cambodia. Welcome, Rikshamai.
Hello, Joe. Nice to be here.
It's nice to have you on again. You joined us for an episode last year that was also looking at climate change topics. But just to remind listeners, let's start by asking you for a really brief overview of social protection in Cambodia.
Yes, thank you. Good to be here again. I would start by giving you a few numbers. The current coverage of social protection in Cambodia is around 7.6 million people, so equivalent to around 44% of total population. So previously, social protection was divided into two pillars because we follow pillar approach. So we have social assistance, which is financed by government budget, and on another pillar is social security, which financed by contribution. But lately, and with further development, Cambodia government see the need to shift from pillar approach to life cycle risk approach for further social protection development. So in February this year, the government developed a new policy framework as an update to the old one, which is called National Social Protection Policy Framework 2024-2035.
This episode is about climate policy and social protection. Nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, are really key parts of that international climate architecture. I understand that you've been working on Cambodia's next iteration of the NDC, that's NDC 3.0, and you're working to integrate social protection. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
The good news for us to share with you as well is that social protection has been considered as a sector in the NDC 3.0, and the process started from early this year and was decided social protection is finally become a sector.
Fantastic, and it is an enormous achievement. We've talked on this podcast in different episodes about the role that social protection could play or can play in supporting adaptation, mitigation and transition. Why was it important for social protection to be considered in Cambodia in this context?
It's a very good question. If you remember last time in the episode on shock responsive social protection where I was in, at that time we are discussing on how the government responds to COVID-19. So everything started when COVID-19 hits. Cambodia is very vulnerable at the time. Social protection system was still new. We only have a couple of main national programs. So at the time, the government put in place an emergency social assistance program to support poor and vulnerable households. But at the same time, the government also working to develop a shock responsive social protection framework, and to develop this framework with only one aim: to provide an emergency response in a systematic way and timely to support poor during shocks when facing pandemic as public health shocks, but also economic shocks and natural disaster or climate shocks. In Cambodia, we face flood almost every year during rainy season, but the severity of the flood vary across the year. We face a severe flood in 2020. Later on, in late 2022, we faced another flood, which the government put in place a emergency program to respond to that as well. We provide additional cash transfer program to near poor households affected by that severe flood. We see the importance of social protection, and a evidence-based evaluation of those programs actually shows that social protection helps stabilize the livelihood of those affected by those shocks, but also not letting them falling into deeper poverty and not letting them adopting negative coping strategy. So with all of these factors, the government sees that social protection actually can be part of NDC, mainly focusing on adaptation. So aligning with the SRSP framework, the government decided to put social protection as a sector in NDC 3.0 to focus on adaptation, but also for just transition to climate change in Cambodia, which we see this work is very important, and our office is proud to have social protection considered as a sector.
Your office plays a really important coordination role across government looking at social protection. And of course, cross-ministry coordination is a really big part of NDC development because it needs to be so multi-sectoral. I'd just be interested to hear from you in Cambodia. Which agencies lead the NDC process? Who else is involved? And how did that coordination come together?
The lead agency or ministry for NDC process is Ministry of Environment. And there is a technical working group, inter-ministry coordination for NDC process. It starts when we have a discussion not on NDC specifically, but on shock responsive social protection or emergency response to shocks, where a member of Ministry of Environment was invited. And in our office, we have a sharing session every Friday to discuss new development related to social protection. We also have another expert sharing about climate change and social protection. So with that in mind, our office sees the importance of getting social protection into NDC. And because NDC process started late last year, so in a very good timing, our office requests a meeting with leadership of Ministry of Environment to present about the importance of social protection and making them aware of what is social protection in Cambodia, and it's important to help address climate change, but also to support people's livelihood when facing any natural disaster or climate shocks. We have a few meetings. The first one was going really well, and then later on, we were invited to do some more presentations to relevant colleagues at the Ministry of Environment. And our office also requests and later was accepted to have a member from our office to be part of the technical working group for climate change. And myself was nominated to be in that technical working group. We have a few meetings and requests, and later on also support from development partners. We have a consensus and agreement to have social protection to be considered as a sector in NDC 3.0. Previously, social protection was mentioned in NDC in different areas, but not as a sector. So for this NDC 3.0, to have social protection to be considered as a main sector is very important steps for Cambodia and also for our office.
Just to follow up on that question about the different kinds of ministries that need to come together as part of the process, has the Ministry of Finance or Economy been involved in the NDC process in Cambodia as well?
Yeah, so there are many more ministries involved from other sectors who have its role in NDC. The Ministry of Economy and Finance of Cambodia is also part of the working group and also part of the process there, the important factors. Our office was actually housed under Ministry of Economy and Finance because the chair of the National Social Protection Council is the Minister of Economy and Finance. So sometimes we also play another coordination role for budget facilitation for social protection programs and schemes. And social protection is considered an important sector, and it is well represented and with colleagues from relevant departments under Ministry of Economy and Finance on board and in the process of NDC as well, which is very important.
So you've said that social protection is a sector, described as a sector within the Cambodia NDC. Just be interested in understanding a little bit more what that means. What will the document say about social protection as a sector once the NDC is released?
So there is 4 measures developed under social protection sector. The first one is building climate resilience among poor, vulnerable, and at-risk population by strengthening routine social protection program and service delivery. The focus is to build the current social protection system that we have now to be ready. The second measure is on reducing climate vulnerability among poor, vulnerable, and at-risk population by implementing shock-responsive social protection, improving interoperability of social protection database system. It's focusing on providing intervention when there is climate shocks, while strengthening the building or investing on shock responsive social protection building blocks so that when there's a shock, a social protection system is ready to provide intervention. The third measure, it's on enabling a just and inclusive transition by expanding social protection to those whose livelihood are or will be affected by climate change. And the fourth measure is on establishing the foundation for climate-sensitive housing-related support for poor, vulnerable population through social protection system. And this fourth measure is focusing on feasibility study on housing-related support. This doesn't mean building new houses, but as a feasibility study on any social protection support that can help people to improve their housing capability to respond to climate shock.
NDCs can also talk about climate financing needs, thinking about what countries need to fund transition measures and achieve those carbon emission reduction targets. Are you also looking at climate financing as a possible source of funding to build social protection systems?
Yes, this is another important question. I could say that it's an very important source, climate financing. During COVID-19 and other shocks, like the severe flood back in 2022, the government used the state budget by reprioritizing budget from other sector to finance social assistance support to those affected. And there was a discussion, if Cambodia faced, unfortunately, in the future, bigger shocks, how can the government or the country finance support? And climate financing was considered, and we have a huge discussion on that. We see its important source of fund to build social protection system. Our office actually is looking into few global funds, GCF fund, another fund, and Global Shields. We see many sources of funding where our office is still studying how to leverage those funds to help building social protection system in a way that it is ready to respond to climate change. We are also looking into disaster risk financing if it is possible or feasible for Cambodia to consider as an alternative source of financing, both to build current system during normal time, but also to a response to climate shock if there's any in the future.
You mentioned development partners earlier, and I was wondering how you have drawn on external support through this process.
Yes, countries like Germany, Australia, and other countries, development partners like UN agency, GIZ, DFAT, so they actually play a big role in providing technical assistance, not just to our office as a play coordination role, but also to other actors within the government, providing technical advice. Because our office, like I mentioned, we just started in 2018. We are quite new. So development partners actually provide good support as of now to build the capacity of our colleagues with our office and also to bring new area or a topic when it was discussed in the region, but also globally. And climate change is one. I could say there is a new trend to gender inclusive social protections. But also now in the world of crisis, facing few crises, we are discussing about social protection and responding to disallocation of people and migrants and so on. Sometimes they also bringing support from other sources of financing, not actually to fund social protection, but to pointing the way so the government can decide to seek the support of funds or not. But Cambodia want to actually focusing on having our own resource and consider sustainability as an important principle. We don't want to build a system where it's not sustainable, and especially using external funds is not sustainable.
The last time we spoke was actually in Australia earlier this year, where you and colleagues from across various ministries, including the Ministry of Environment in Cambodia, came for a study tour to see the Australian social welfare system. What was that like?
Actually, an amazing study visit we had. I used to live in Australia for 2 years, but I'm not aware of those things. The study visit was enlightening. We study about Australia's social protection system, but also on emergency response and climate change. It's amazing on how the government agency, different agency, but also NGO play key role as well in supporting people affected by shock and climate change. I have a lot of key takeaways from that study visit. A main thing for our office is social protection actors and operators. One is Service Australia, which is an operator provide support from the government to Australians. The service they provide, the call centers, the hotline, and how they manage their center within the country was amazing. And we have a similar actor in Cambodia as a social assistant operator we call National Social Assistance Fund. I personally see Service Australia is not to replicate, but as an inspiration for the institutions to move forward. From that, I also see the importance of other actors or area where Cambodia could focus on. The housing support provided by Australian government to the people affected by shock is important. And like I mentioned, the fourth measure of social protection within NDCs is on housing. I could say it's not actually inspired, but it confirms our belief that focusing on that would be a good link to social protection and climate change.
A lot of countries are working through their NDCs this year, and there has been some advocacy around having more countries do exactly what you've just done, which is bring social protection explicitly into the NDC. So you've had success. What have the lessons been that you've learned, or perhaps what advice would you give to another country or another social protection agency like yourself that's thinking about how to bring social protection into this climate policy discussion?
I would say I have a couple of points that I might share. The first one is that as a coordinating body, a facilitation, requesting for meeting, requesting to have any topic put on the table is very important. And from there, if we see social protection is an important tool to respond to shock, then let the Ministry of Environment or any agency responsible for NDC knows that it is important. Sharing what you know, sharing the evidence, and they could see the same. So first advice is just ring the bell or knock on the doors. The second point is bringing development partners along. Development partners play a big role in NDC process, could provide co-assistance, but also an advocate for climate financing. Other countries might say, if we bring social protection to NDC or to climate change policy, it could create a lot of burden. For us, we also believe like that. But during discussion and with support from development partners, sometimes social protection can play a big role without incurring a lot of finance burden. We are just bringing what we have now to one step further by improving the system. So this does not create a lot of budget burden for the country. And the third point I want to raise is that Ministry of Environment might also be interested in how social protection could play in getting more climate financing. Because when social protection is put into NDC, sometimes it's a good indication or factor to get more support from global funds to fund NDC and other climate change and policy.
I'm so excited that we've managed to have you come back on and hear more about this journey that Cambodia has been on. As you say, from, COVID to that thinking around shock responsive social protection, and now applying that into the realities of climate change, building it into the climate architecture for Cambodia. It's a really exciting story. So, Rikshamai, thank you so much again for joining us on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you, and great to be here again.
Before we go, we like to end each episode with some quick wins. We ask our guests to bring in some recommendations for research, news, or events that have sparked their interest and that we think you should know more about. Joining us for Quick Wins today is Shayanti Sengupta. Shayanti is Technical Advisor for Social Protection and Climate at the Red Cross and Red Crescent Climate Centre. Welcome, Shayanti.
Thank you so much for having me, Jo.
Shayanti, your first pick today is a note that you co-authored. It provides practical guidance for countries on how to integrate social protection into their NDCs. So what do you think it will take to elevate social protection in these really important climate policies?
Well, one of the biggest challenges that I feel we are grappling with is the how question. We often hear these recommendations, right? Like reports saying we need better coordination or experts talking that our sectors need to work together. But how to do this in reality is often missing. And this is where we all, under the USP 2030 working group on social protection and climate change, we thought, okay, we need something that's very concrete that outlines these practical steps that can support ministries countries and governments trying to integrate social protection into the climate change discussion. That's how we started on with the note. Also, the note got a little bit updated and adapted by the NDC partnership, which was lovely because we then could also target the climate change and environment actors who are in charge of updating some of these NDCs. And we also tweaked the language, made it more relevant to what the climate sector actors are more familiar with. So basically, to answer your question, I think there needs to be a very deliberate and intentional shift from all of us to make those clear connections on how social protection can be strategically involved in these discussions. Maybe one practical example of this is looking into a sectoral strategy. For example, a country has an energy policy or a just transition policy, and we could look into that and say that here is an anchor. We are going to be talking about those people who are directly affected by the transition, and social protection is something that you need to provide to these, right? So you have these sectoral policies and you have social protection as an instrument that can support achieving those sectoral policies.
Chayante, just then you mentioned that there had been a need to adjust some terminology or maybe translate sort of the terms that social protection practitioners are using to align better with the language that climate and energy ministries might be using in their work. That's really interesting nuance. I was just wondering if you had an example of one of those adjustments or that translation that needed to be done.
Yeah. For example, in social protection, we don't have as much of monitoring and evaluation for climate-related outcomes. So we often would speak in terms of social protection, reducing malnutrition or income poverty and things like this. But the extension of that is that you're reducing vulnerability of these groups. You are improving their capacities in different ways. And this makes them also have the capacity to maybe avoid some of these negative coping strategies that climate change or climate extreme events will bring about, right? This is contributing to adaptation, but we don't speak about that or make that connection there. So I think we have tried to really use adaptation, mitigation, just transition, loss and damage where possible, because we are speaking to this climate audience.
Turning to your second selection, it's the most recent report from the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Olivier de Schutter. It's called Weathering the Storm, Poverty, Climate Change and Social Protection. As usual, the Special Rapporteur pulls no punches. What's his call to action in this report?
I think there are multiple messages if you really read through it, and some very important calls to action, including the Global Fund for Social Protection, which I think is the biggest one people are talking about. So the Global Fund for Social Protection, or the idea around it, has existed before social protection for climate change became fashionable in some ways, right? And I think that now this is about having this fund front and central, including climate financing flowing into this fund, and making sure that these invest in the social protection systems. Another core message is that social protection is the way to build resilience. So he talks about different kinds of social protection instruments, which can help people not only withstand, but also recover from the extreme events and address climate change impacts better.
Yeah, the report really highlights some statistics about how much climate financing is currently trickling down to the poorest and most vulnerable people. If you think about what climate financing is typically being used for, it's perhaps not surprising. So, countries are investing in big economic transitions around energy, transport, land use, and all of those things. But as you've just said, of course, it is the poorest that bear the brunt, not just of climate change, but of the costs of those mitigation strategies. A key message, as you say, is that low-income households need more support, and that social mechanism is a mechanism or even the mechanism to provide it. But of course, it's about making that translation, isn't it, from international financing actually flowing through social protection systems. We're a long way from that reality, I think. There is a lot of interest in leveraging climate financing to build social protection systems or catalyse them, especially in that adaptation space and the sort of compensation for loss and damage. Are we seeing this shift? Are we seeing more climate financing going through to strengthening these systems yet? Or is this still really a space where it's sort of advocacy in search of outcomes, if you like?
The short answer is no, or not yet. But also, I would imagine that the strengthening of the systems and improving your own core social protection also needs to come from the national governments. And of course, there are some countries which will need the additional support to make that happen. And in those cases, I feel like a small shift happening, like high-level discussions around climate financing in terms of Green Climate Fund or Adaptation Fund, or even the Loss and Damage Fund, which is supposed to start funding projects by end of this year. We are seeing some of these funds discuss how social protection projects can be funded. But I also see the justification for strengthening social protection systems from the national governments themselves, because this is something that you're investing in your adaptation, in your resilience building. And while we can expect, or while we would hope to see more rise of climate finance, it might not necessarily be for strengthening the system itself. It might be for getting channeled through the system to the poor people, or to the vulnerable people, or to those getting affected, but not necessarily for building a social protection registry, which is core part of the system. And I think this is also something from the national sovereignty perspective. There are some countries which want to invest in their own systems and build their own systems from their budget. But on the other hand, there is also climate funds that have unused fund money, which might be very crucial for some of these low-income, small island developing states to use. So I think that there is also this move from the climate fund side to make these application processes, accreditation processes, or like how you can access the fund easier. So I think there are these global discussions happening to make sure more applications, more proposals can be made. But at the end of the day, the proposals also need to be made by the countries. So social protection needs to feature in very clearly when applying to a climate fund. So that's the core message, right? Social protection needs to be used to achieve climate adaptation and mitigation goals. And I do see some of these donor funding, for example, which have funded previously shock responsive projects in different countries through social protection. I'm seeing call for proposals mentioning strengthening of systems now. So very clearly they put like improving registries, improving data accuracy, improving interoperability of systems, improving targeting. So very core social protection system components are being asked as part of shock responsive social protection programs. So I do see the shift happening very slowly. It might need to come from both sides, from the governments and the national actors making that space and strengthening their systems, and then the support coming from the international community, and in a big way.
Thank you, Shayanti Sengupta, for joining me on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for listening to the Social Protection Podcast, brought to you by socialprotection.org. You can find all of our episodes on the socialprotection.org website and on your favourite podcast platforms. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review. Back next month. See you then.